morning. My name is Jovan Kurbalija. I'm Director of DiploFoundation and Head of Geneva Internet Platform. And I'm honored to welcome you to our discussion on digital economy, trade and finance. As you notice from this video tour, it's a part of 12 tours through international Geneva, where we are trying to guide and interlink coverage of different digital issues. Last month, we covered digital standardization. This month, we focused on the digital economy. Next month, we'll focus on interplay between digital and environment. Today, we are particularly honored to have with us a very diverse and competent group of experts who can reflect both on the digital economy, e-commerce, digital trade, whatever you frame it, and link of those developments to Geneva, which is our particular focus. We have with us, and I will start with the only lady in today's session, Marilia Maciel, Digital Policy Senior Researcher at DiploFoundation. We have with us Richard Hill, President of Association for Proper Internet Governance, Professor Michael Candace, Senior Fellow and Visiting Lecturer at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. And last but not least, Mr. David Skovronski from Permanent Mission of Australia to WTO here in Geneva. As you can see, we have a high diversity of academics, practitioners, and people who can reflect from on the different angles on digital economy and in particular e-commerce developments in Geneva. Before we dive deep in all of these issues and maximize on the time that we have for this discussion, let me just frame it with one of the graphics which was very popular these days. Who led the digital transformation of your company, CEO, CTO, or COVID-19? I'm sure that you came across those my memes and the similar graphics. We have been hearing a lot on impact on the COVID-19 and pandemics on digital economy, digitalization of our daily routines, and some of the graphics are, or some of the statistics is rather to some way almost shocking. As you can see from these statistics, the GDP of the entire African continent is in 2019 is similar to the Apple's market capitalization at the end of 2020. It's in the range of 2.3 trillion US dollars. Now, I know the economists will complain about comparing the market capitalization and GDP, but when you move to the gross revenue, you come very close to some of the major countries in Europe. We're speaking about really enormous power of tech companies. And it is not surprising that you have so many anti-competition initiative moves in different areas, from the content policy in Australia. It started the year with the question of the new legislation in Australia, to, well, European Union, which has been leader in the question of the market competition and antitrust, to the United States and China, recently with all cases on Alibaba. Therefore, the digital economy scene is getting very vibrant, moving beyond traditional policy spaces, and many of these developments are to some extent reflected in Geneva. Now, I will start with inviting Marilia Maciel to reflect on latest developments based on her activities. Marilia has been conducting research on digital and developments and digital economy and developments in Geneva and preparing a new course on e-commerce. Therefore, she has her hand on the pulse on the economic and e-commerce dynamics in Geneva. Marilia, now if I can use this health terminology, what is the pulse of e-commerce discussions in Geneva? Give us a snapshot. And with that, we'll start discussion. Over to you.
Thank you, Jovan, and thank you for providing this initial scenario. Hello to everyone. I think from what you said, it's really clear that the big tech companies have been the big winners of digitalization, but in the e-commerce landscape, the scenario has been much more nuanced. A recent research has been published by UNCTAD showing that third parties, online marketplaces have definitely benefited from the moving to online that has taken place, and not only big companies such as Amazon, but also regional companies such as Mercado Libre, Jumia, but companies that sell their goods and services online had a much more difficult scenario to deal with, and 58% report that their revenues have decreased. And against this background, what the organizations in Geneva are doing has been extremely important, not only revealing these trends, and UNCTAD has been an organization that has published a fundamental research, not only on the impact of COVID, but on the impact of e-commerce on development more generally, but also assisting countries, developing countries, to prepare themselves to a scenario in which e-commerce is widespread. They have published assessments of the national landscape, showing countries what they need to improve in order to really benefit from e-commerce. Besides UNCTAD, we have other organizations based in Geneva that have been very active, such as the International Trade Center, ITC, that has been a leading organization in helping small and medium-sized companies to also engage in cross-border trade, providing assistance and capacity building. And we have the World Trade Organization, which I believe will be one of the key organizations that we will focus in today's debate. Because they promote global rules on trade, and they have an ongoing processes dedicated to developing rules on e-commerce. The work of the WTO currently is developed in two main processes. One of them is the work program on electronic commerce that has been launched since 1998, and it's a very important process that has built understanding among member states on e-commerce and how e-commerce affects trade. Discussions have been reached over the years, and it is the only process that now gathers all WTO members to discuss e-commerce. In parallel to that, some member states decided and found out that it's time to move on and have some binding rules on e-commerce, and they have launched a joint statement initiative on e-commerce to do so, which has a very broad and very interesting agenda that covers issues that are at the very core of the trade agenda, such as enabling e-commerce, trade facilitation, but also covers issues that have been discussed elsewhere as well in digital policy circles, such as cybersecurity, privacy, data flows, and access to the source code. So these are issues that the digital policy community has been discussing in other organizations, such as in the ITU, for instance, or in the WCIS process. And I think that one of the important points to discuss today, and one of the challenges that we have, is how to connect the dots between discussions on trade that are becoming ever more important and ever more broad, and how do we take advantage of this acquis of knowledge and expertise that other non-trade organizations in Geneva have gathered over the years? How do we put that into trade discussions to make trade discussions more rich? And I think that one of the points that we need to bear in mind is that the GSI now has more than 80 countries participating in it. There are developed countries, there are developing countries, and it's very important to mainstream the concerns and the needs of developing countries in this process. We have followed how the proposals have been tabled. We had access to the last chair summary that has been published in December, which is the last consolidated negotiating document coming from the GSI. And apparently proposals coming from developing countries, they are not very large in number. Most of the proposals have been tabled by developed countries so far, which in itself doesn't say anything, but it's very important that this look on development and this focus on development and how to make e-commerce leverage development is very important, especially in the context of the COVID-19 crisis that you mentioned in the beginning, because e-commerce has been pointed out as one of the key things that could really help countries in their economic recovery. So one of the things that I expect we will discuss today is how this process of developing rules on e-commerce can leverage development in a better way. Thank you, Jovan. Over to you.
Marilia, if we can conclude, after a bit of a lull or sleepy period in the e-commerce discussion, the pulse starting beating again. Now, Michael Kende, Mike, the question is the following. You do the analysis of the overall economic development, congratulations for your new book, and you also understand the local Geneva dynamics. What just Marilia said is interesting, that we always hear about rise of the power of the big companies, Alibaba, Amazon, and others. But it seems, based on this UNCTAD report, that there is a new interesting development of the local tech companies or e-commerce companies in developing countries. Could you reflect on that, that dynamics?
Sure, yeah. No, thanks for the question and thanks for the invitation. It's always a pleasure. I mean, I think that's a good point, that I mean, tech really does offer opportunities for smaller companies to develop. I think that bringing it back to the discussion that that Marilia started, one of the key issues really is getting some economies of scale. I mean, this is what you know, Amazon started in a garage, but now the scale is just enormous of their investment in the data centers, in fulfillment centers, in, you know, every aspect, delivery. And I think that that's where we can come back to what might or might not happen at the WTO, that companies are getting off the ground, they're starting to grow, but they need some scale and they need to be able to deliver across borders, and that requires trade rules. We can also touch, I think, in a little bit on trust. You need a lot of trust to order something from overseas, particularly if you're not used to it. And that requires a lot of rules as well. So I think that to get these companies to the next level, is going to need some kind of cross-border rules, whether it's regional trade agreements, single markets, or global rules.
Thank you, Mike. Let me just introduce the question to Richard. Richard, we are hearing now what was initial sort of landscape survey by Marilia and now Michael, that there are developments, there are good developments in developing countries. There is a challenge of scaling the power of the small and medium enterprises, let's say, from developing countries, and need for some trans-border rules. We know from your previous inputs in our discussion that you are concerned and skeptical about some type of the rules. Are you in general concerned about rules of managing trans-border economy, or what is your particular concern? Could you just give us a few points and then we move into discussion?
Yes, I would agree with Michael that rules are needed. The problem is that we don't need the rules that are being proposed. We need completely different rules. In fact, e-commerce has grown, as we know, and the pandemic has actually facilitated the growth of e-commerce. So it's clear that you don't need rules to have e-commerce. We have rules that allow e-commerce. We've had them since the 1990s when I was doing electronic data interchange. They need to be improved and evolved, of course, but we don't need what is being proposed, because what is being proposed is meant to enshrine the status quo where a few dominant companies will continue to dominate and to extract data and to give services which are worth much less than the data. So the current rules will simply keep the concentration going and make things worse. And it's not just about money, it's about dominating the whole system, because we know that data is underpinning AI, and AI is going to be taking over a lot of things. I agree with Marilia that UNCTAD has excellent documents on this. I would urge everybody who's interested in this to read what comes out of UNCTAD, because it's well balanced and reasonable. And in terms of WTO, let's be honest. What WTO should be doing now is agreeing a TRIPS waiver so that we can produce enough vaccines. And what are they doing instead? They're worrying about spam. Why is WTO worrying about spam? Spam is not a trade issue, it's an ITU issue. So let ITU work on spam, and WTO, let's get rid of these rules that were meant to enshrine domination of pharmas and other big companies, which are in fact preventing the world from advancing the way it should advance. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Therefore, we have now a common understanding that we need rules for cross-border economy. We have element of different views or slight disagreement that you think that some rules exist, some rules may be needed, but the rules that are proposed are not proper. Let me bring into discussion, David, with one observation, which is related to previous few comments. Richard, for example, mentioned the data monopolies, which is concern of everybody. But we have in the joint statement initiatives countries who are not producers of a lot of data. As a matter of fact, Australia recently challenged big companies with their new media law. We have, except China and US, who are data generating powers and who can produce, we have many countries which are not producers of data. David, could you give us some reflection on this question, or so far? We need the rules. Is the WTO right place to put these rules? Do we need new rules? And we'll then move also to what Richard mentioned. What should be negotiated in the WTO and what should be negotiated in other spaces? Over to you, David.
Yeah, thanks very much for those questions and for those initial comments, and thanks for having me today. There are quite a few questions in there, and I will try to address them, but please feel free to call me out if I don't. Yes, I mean, I think, you know, as a starting point, of course, I would agree that the COVID pandemic has accelerated the digital transformation, and digital trade is going to play a critical role in economic recovery from COVID-19, and that includes as countries transition out of COVID-19, where we still have restrictions in place. So there'll still be a significant dependency on online services and online shopping, but a lot of the transition that's taken place in that space will stick, we expect. And we think that countries like Australia and others, and you know, potentially the 85 other members in the e-commerce negotiations at the WTO, think that rules on digital trade can help to encourage further digital trade growth, given it's important, but also help provide a framework for how digital trade grows. And help sort of strike a balance between business needs and consumer needs. So that's kind of why the 86 countries in the WTO are working on this initiative. I mean, from Australia's perspective, it's certainly not about enshrining the status quo, as Richard put it. We think that the digital economy offers significant opportunities for developing countries and countries where the dominant tech players globally aren't located. Countries like Australia, for example, which doesn't have the same scale of tech companies as some other countries, but we see significant opportunities in the digital economy for Australian business, and we think those opportunities exist for developing countries as well, including MSMEs in those countries, and rules that promote openness and rules that protect consumers can help to guide the growth of digital trade in that way. On terms of the question on whether some of the rules that are being negotiated in the joint statement initiative belong in that discussion, I think rules like consumer protection, privacy, spam, cybersecurity, these things are very much linked to trade. We would argue, because they go to consumer confidence and trust in the online space, and they're an important part of striking the balance between consumer and business interests. So we recognise that there is work going on these issues in other spaces too, but there is a place for trade rules governing these kinds of issues, and they can play a different role to some of the discussions in other technical agencies. So typically on some of these issues, you'll see in trade rules or in e-commerce chapters in FTAs, you'll see relatively high level commitments that set kind of broad parameters for how countries should regulate, and I think they have a real value. And we're progressing, we're working through them as long as kind of other rules on, I suppose, more sort of mainstream e-commerce issues as well. And just a final point, I suppose, is that the WTO. I mean, there is a lot going on at the WTO, and we're focused on digital trade, but of course, there's also an important discussion on IP issues, as Richard alluded to. But I won't sort of get into that here, I suppose. Thanks.
Thank you, David. We had a few interesting comments in our chat discussion.
Thank you, David.
For example, Gurav said, do you think that issues such as data privacy should be tackled in the current discussion or in other fora? That it seems to be an interesting emerging controversy in our discussion. We sort of agreed we need the rules for the global economic trade. Many of these rules exist. Now, where are the differences are emerging are what should be the role of WTO and what are the existing roles that we should use and how to tackle trade-related issues. I used the term non-trade issues, but I was corrected by one colleague that it's not a proper framing. We had also an interesting comment from Peter Gruter. Peter, welcome to the session, arguing that there is a lot on the controlling big tech in the US, but not that much in Asia. Yes, it's more visible what's happening in the Brussels and Washington nowadays. Well, in Canberra also at the beginning of the year. But it's not that visible what's happening, for example, in China with the challenge to Alibaba and their financial company, also in India. That is emerging, and that dynamics is getting clearer and clearer. We have also a few other comments that we'll tackle. I'm seeing that we have very lively debate, and Richard is as a master of the text chat debates. He's answering it directly. But let's move a bit now to the point which was raised in discussion. We have agreement that we need to do something. We have also the WTO work program on e-commerce, which was established in 1998, which paved the way for the fast growth of the internet and opened the space for developments. And one of the questions, elephant in the room, we'll have many elephants in the room, big, small, even in the virtual room, is can we expect the moratorium to be permanent? And what are the different rules? Let's start with Michael, with a quick reflection on that dynamics, 1998 moratorium. Some countries are questioning it, and what are the different views? Michael, and then we move to Richard and Marilia and David.
Sure. Good question. Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to, when we start thinking about this, go back to 1998, and that was when the web was just starting to become commercial. There was very little paid content. If you remember, the companies were just kind of falling all over themselves to offer free services and somehow assumed that they would have an IPO and that the money would follow at some point. And obviously for a few companies that was true, but not many. So at the time, it wasn't much of a concession. It was also really a concession to reality. It's hard to detect these transmissions. And now with caches, even if you can detect one transmission of a paid good, a paid transmission, it can be cached in the country and sold hundreds, thousands of times without crossing a border again. So, it's hard. It's a hard one to change in a sense. But on the other hand, there are more and more paid transmissions, more and more services. Something that's sent electronically can be a 3D printing plan that then can be turned into a good. So it is getting a little trickier, and I think there will be more pressure on it, but there's a lot of technical challenges to overcome because it's so easy to send things through VPNs and with caches that wouldn't really would be one-time transmissions or very hard to detect. So I think there'll be more pressure on it, but in practical terms, it'll be hard to change.
Thank you, Michael. Richard, what is your take on the 1998 moratorium? I know that you were very active in e-commerce at that time at the Hewlett-Packard. Give us your estimate. What should happen, and what do you expect to happen on moratorium?
No, I fully agree with Michael. In 1998, that made sense because there wasn't much, and you want to favor it and have it going. Now let's look at the future. Everything is going to be electronic. There's going to be very little physical left. Most of the value added is going to be electronic. So the proponents of the tax moratorium say, oh, it's bad for you if you have a customs duty. Well, let countries decide that individually. If it's bad for Ruritania to have a customs duty, Ruritania will decide not to have a customs duty. Why do we know what's best for Ruritania? Note that the proposals to continue the moratorium always come from the US and its allies. Why do the US and the allies know what's better for Ruritania? Let Ruritania decide. And by the way, all of the proponents of the moratorium say, oh, we don't want customs duties, but it's okay if you have taxes, because we don't want to eliminate taxes. We do understand that you do have to have taxes. Yet in practice, every country that's attempted to put on a digital tax, the US has come along and say, you can't have that. It violates some other part of some other WTO agreement. So in reality, again, this is a big tech agenda. No company wants to pay taxes. No individual wants to pay taxes. Yet we recognize that they're necessary. So we have to allow both digital taxes, and a form of digital taxation could be a customs duty. There is an enforcement issue. I fully agree with Michael, but that's also true for digital taxes. It's true for VAT. It's true for income tax. It's true for everything. And so you have mechanisms in place which don't involve snooping at the border, Michael. I wouldn't see it that way. I would rather audit company books. And if you have if you're making a lot of money and you don't have any sales, you say, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? Where's that money coming from? Oh, electronic transactions. Well, how come you didn't declare them? So yes, we do have enforcement issues, but we have to look at it that way. The time has come to recognize that the entire economy is going digital. And why do you want to exclude one type of taxes? Well, it's just like saying we shouldn't have VAT on digital transactions. Well, why not? Let Ruritania decide whether they want income tax, VAT, sales tax, customs duty, whatever. And if they do something stupid that doesn't work, that's their problem. It's not for us to impose on them.
Well, Richard, that's interesting point, but it is going a bit of unwinding the economic global governance with quite a strong argument, but it is also to some extent counterintuitive for the achieved level of global governance. Marilia, what is your take from these previous two comments, and what is going on in the community with whom you interact on the question of moratorium?
One of the big problems is that the discussion on the moratorium has been bundled in other discussions that have been left unresolved over the years. So what is the status of electronic transmissions, and in particular of dematerialized products? Are they goods? Are they services? This is the kind of question that the work program has struggled for many years, and there are not a definitive answer because the issue is not technical, it's also political. So while we don't move forward with this other parallel issues, it will be difficult to move forward with a moratorium. From an economic standpoint, we are still in the process of economically defining and finding the tools to measure the digital economy. So it's no surprise that there are studies that have been published that show very different results when you have the moratorium and when you have not. There are some studies that show that it would be to the advantage of developing countries to render the moratorium permanent. There are other studies that say the complete opposite, and that is related to the fact that we do not have yet those clear measurements and economic tools to measure the digital economy and what is going on. So there are things that need to move forward, I think, before we have clarity on this debate to make definitive decisions. That's why, from what I see from discussions, it will be very difficult that we achieve a consensus on rendering the moratorium permanent by the next ministerial. I think that the current practice of renewing it on a temporary basis, it will be what will be adopted again in the future. and let's see how it will move on. But related to your previous questions, I think one important point is that we do have very important issues that are being discussed in the GSI. And one of them are related to enabling issues, facilitating electronic trade, trade facilitation. This is really important to development. And even more so in the context of COVID, that we see the number of parcels soaring. So I think that more attention, especially from developed countries that have not put a lot of weight on the negotiation of these particular chapters in the GSI, is very important, because if we could move this forward and fill some gaps that were left behind by the trade facilitation agreement when it comes to using digital technologies to facilitate trade, that will be to the benefit of everyone, including developing countries as well.
Marilia, excellent point on the tactics of the negotiation. There are two theories. You bundle issues together and then you make a deal, or you go issue by issue. That's two diplomatic tactics. You're now arguing that there is a risk for putting everything together and then either going to the least common denominator or breaking the overall negotiation. That's an interesting point. Thank you, Richard, for pointing to one important aspect, difference between taxation and custom. There is no global governance of the taxation. That's true. There is some developments in OECD, as we know, in that direction with Ottawa principles and other issues, but there are no firm rules and the customs, obviously. And your point that there is a study from UNCTAD arguing that custom moratorium doesn't benefit developing countries. There are some other studies, and this brings me to another point before I pass the floor to David to reflect on moratorium, is that we have very often little evidence or not solid evidence to discuss these issues. And this is one of the concerns of some countries, that they don't want to enter into something which has many known unknowns and some unknown unknowns. Therefore, we'll reflect later on it. David, what is your take on these reflections on moratorium? And I know you are the only representative of the country in this context, therefore we'll understand your position. But as much as you can go into media res, into the substance, it would be appreciated for our discussion. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jovan, and everyone for those comments. There's a lot in this discussion as well, and it's a very interesting one. I'll try to touch on some of the points. Broadly, from Australia's perspective, the e-commerce moratorium is a critical part of the international trading system, and we see it as something that has helped to promote the growth of digital trade over the last 20 years. And given the increasing importance of digital trade, including to economic recovery from COVID-19, we think it's very important that the moratorium be retained. I think one of your initial questions, Jovan, was should it or will it be made permanent? Australia's preference is that it would be made permanent, and we have commitments in some FTAs that sort of effectively make it permanent between Australia and our FTA partners. And that's our position in the WTO as well. Having said that, if I was to make a bet, I would bet against the 164 WTO members making it permanent at MC12. I think a more likely outcome is an extension, another sort of 2-year extension of the moratorium. On some of the other interesting points that have been made. Yes, I think one of the principles at the WTO, is that sort of underpin the countries have got together to work at WTO is sort of openness and also non-discrimination. So the moratorium, obviously promotes openness by limiting the country's ability to erect trade barriers in digital trade, but it's also promotes non-discrimination, and that is one of the sort of distinctions between taxes, or some taxes, and customs duties. So customs duties are about sort of discriminating between domestic and foreign suppliers. And certainly there are taxes that are applied to digital products and digital services. And Australia applies our GST to digital products, and that works pretty effectively. But the distinction we would make is that that's not discriminatory, so it doesn't prejudice the trade flows from particular countries. And the other point in terms about letting the examples Mauritius sort of choose what it wants to do. Well, yeah, I mean, it's up to Mauritius if it wants to sign up to the rule, but it has, and I think it's a sort of fundamental question about the role of international cooperation through treaties and commitments through treaties. It's because they're sort of reflecting a kind of a shared perspective on collective benefits in particular kind of ways of doing things. And the WTO was generally about promoting openness as a way of improving economic efficiency and bringing about better outcomes for all participating members. Then the interesting point on the distinction between goods and services, yes, this comes up quite a bit in this context, but I think if you look at the rules, the sort of simple rule that is the moratorium, or the way it's reflected in FTAs, it sort of doesn't necessarily matter, because you're looking at electronic transmissions, and it doesn't really, there's no need to draw a line between whether a digital product is a good or a service in that context. It makes sense either way. And then another point I want to make on one of the studies that's been talked about. There is an UNCTAD study on the moratorium, but there are a range of pretty obvious problems with it, and some of these are pointed out in other studies that I would say are more credible, and they include an OECD study, which is a pretty careful analysis, which points out that the benefits of the moratorium far outweigh any impacts in terms of revenue. And there's another study from ECIP, which I think is the European Centre for International Political Economy, that I'd suggest you take a look at as well. The final point I just want to respond to is the trade facilitation point. So yeah, I sort of agree that a lot of developing countries have interest in trade facilitation issues, and these are being discussed in the JSI and been given equal airtime to other issues, and certainly I expect some good outcomes on that in the JSI. Thanks.
Thank you, David. One aspect which Yvette Stevens mentioned in the comments was related to development aspect, and basically arguing you can make whatever want rules, but if there is no infrastructure, countries cannot benefit. Now let's move from what we have so far. We have discussion on moratorium. There are clear linkages to other WTO debates. Marilia signaling that there is a risk of bundling everything together, but also benefiting from trade facilitation. Therefore, that requires more wisdom. And we now come to the bit bigger elephant in the room, bigger than moratorium, which is a joint statement initiative and negotiation which are going in this context. And here already Richard hinted to the question of directly non-trade related issues. Richard, we'll start with you. And one aspect in interviews in build-up to the event was that it's not necessarily binary issue. Many podcast interviews said, okay, we are not going to change the rules of standardization organization or ITU, but these rules have to be somehow mentioned because they affect trade. Therefore, could we move from this binary to more analog, if I can use framing of non-trade issues and the joint statement initiative? Over to you.
Yeah, I'll give a couple examples, but basically, as I said on the chat, what sense does it make to have trade lawyers negotiate provisions on spam when you can just go across the street and ask the technical experts in ITU to do it, or if you don't like ITU, ask the IETF or whatever to do it? This is obvious nonsense, especially when WTO meetings are completely closed to non-state actors, and even the national delegations are pretty closed. For example, I can get into the Swiss national delegation into ITU. I can't speak, but I can be there. They'll never let me in anywhere near WTO. In fact, they won't even talk to me. So WTO is notoriously closed, and trade negotiations are notoriously closed, so they're not getting the technical input. I find it astonishing that when I look at the leaked version of the GSI text, there are provisions in there which are literally the same as the proponents refuse to consider an ITU related to spam and security. Wait a minute. Why are we refusing to discuss provisions in ITU related to spam and security on the grounds that we don't want international treaties on this stuff? And then you do exactly the same thing in WTO. And by the way, you don't even know what you're talking about. So for example, the e-signature provisions that I've seen proposed in WTO either make no sense or are actually counterproductive and will have unintended side effects. There's an expert commission on this called UNCTAD, which has been extremely successful and whose recommendations have been widely adopted and have enabled e-commerce. And anybody who actually does e-commerce knows that and is well familiar with that. So the only thing that WTO should do in those areas is, and I think that would make sense, put in a provision saying all members agree to transpose to national law relevant UNCTAD model laws. That would be okay. But no, they want to reinvent the model law. So they have experts at UNCTAD who developed the model law, and now they want to transpose that into a treaty in WTO, and the people who are doing that actually don't know what they're talking about. So that's why, you know, these non-trade issues, coming back to how to solve things, how to broaden it up, to me, it's pretty obvious. We should take advantage of the diversity of the organizations in Geneva. UNCTAD happens to be in Vienna, but that's not far away. And WTO should open that up and say, hey, guys, we want to think about spam. Anybody know anything about spam? And then you'd have all kinds of people showing up and saying, yeah, we're the experts on spam, and here's what you should do or not do. And in the end, you'd realize, well, actually, there isn't anything for WTO to do about spam. It's a whole bunch of different issues. And on e-signature, you'll realize, oh, well, yeah, we should simply recommend that people transpose the UNCTAD stuff. And then maybe we have some suggestions for UNCTAD for what more UNCTAD might do. But they should be doing it because those are the experts.
Thank you, Richard. What we notice in discussion is that very often this is sometimes matter of the inertia or dynamics, which is not necessarily, sometimes it's inspired by forum shopping by some actors, but rarely, you know, UNCTAD is a good example. Everybody signed it. It's a reasonable, non-controversial law. Why not to use it? Of course, spam, ITU dynamics, and WTO has some other institutional connotations, but that's important issue, especially for us in Geneva. Can we make these discussions more informed and not reinvent the wheel if the wheel exists? It functions well, like in digital signature. Michael, there are a few questions now from the debate moving towards OECD, for example, negotiation. But let's just make one comment. David mentioned a few studies. We are going to send a link in the follow-up to our discussion on these studies, which argue that custom moratorium is beneficial. Michael, could you reflect on a bit on what Richard mentioned, develop it, but also if you can focus a bit on OECD, what's going on there and how it is going to influence, how Paris is going to influence discussions in Geneva?
Yeah, no, I think that what Richard was saying makes a lot of sense. Looking at UNCTAD, I don't know if that's multi-stakeholder, but at least they're experts in the area that they focused on. I suspect that if we start looking at things like data flows, that the discussion becomes a lot more, and privacy and security, it becomes a little more complicated. And certainly data flows are integral to trade, to digital trade, but there's also a lot of other issues around that. So that might be an interesting thing to look at, but I think that overall I agree with Richard that you know, that there's already existing pieces that can be pointed to and other expertise that can be brought into the discussions. On the OECD, I noticed, yes, it's obviously a club of developed countries, but the companies that would be paying these taxes are, for the most part, in the developed countries. And I mean, it seems to me the most direct way to avoid some of the issues that we were talking about of trying to track transmissions and tax transmissions with customs duties, then some of the discrimination issues. So of course, there's a big difference between theory and practice, but the idea would be to you know, avoid the digital taxes that are coming up and how they're being imposed. Some countries are imposing taxes on free services, which is very difficult and very distortionary and instead try and focus, and I believe the new Biden administration is talking about this as well, try and really focus on the least distortionary, which would be don't tax the services, don't tax the transmissions, tax the ultimate profits, and distribute them on based on where they're, where they have been earned, and not necessarily where the intellectual property has been put as a home. So I think that there's a lot there. Nothing is perfect, but it seems like it's a good way of moving forward that can avoid some of the issues we've been talking about here.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Before we move to Marilia, to the question of developing countries, let me ask David one quick reflection. David, Australia raised a lot of attention at the beginning of the year with the new legislation for the big tech companies. And the question of taxation of sharing the income was underlying. You are involved prominently in WTO, you're involved in the OECD processes. Could you give us some hint, since you would like to preserve more taxing, more money for the budget for the Australian economy, while you're a strong proponent of the open economy and the free flow of data and other issues? How are you resolving as Australia this sort of, to some extent, contradictory dynamics? Over to you, David.
Yeah, thanks, Jovan. I'm going to sort of disappoint you slightly here and reveal that I'm not really an expert on the OECD tax discussions, precisely because they're in the OECD and I very much live in a WTO world at the moment. But yes, I mean, there is a sort of a tension there and a balance. I sort of see what you're saying broadly, and I mean, from Australia's perspective, we are in favour of openness, and that goes to the principle of non-discrimination. So generally we're a country that doesn't have, in terms of physical goods, very high tariffs that we apply, because we're sort of believers in broadly free trade, and we extend that belief to the online space as well. So where we apply taxes to generate revenue from digital trade, they're taxes that don't discriminate between foreign and overseas suppliers.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Let's use the last 10 minutes and see how we can bring other actors into discussion, and why developing countries are missing. Is it related to the clear economic interests? Is it related to the fear to enter into unknown unknowns or known unknowns, which we mentioned before? Marilia, what would be your quick mapping if you have to explain to the Martians why we have only up to 90 countries in GSI, why other countries are missing, and many of them are developing countries? And thank you to everybody for staying away from acronyms and WTO or IG, the lingo. That's very useful. Marilia, over.
Thank you, Jovan. I think that there are several reasons that help to explain that. The first of them is that many developing countries, they do not have national laws on some of the many issues that are being tackled under the GSI. So they have no national clear position or a blueprint that they can use to move forward and negotiate that on an international level. So there's not much reference there. There's also a concern that we are in the midst of the Doha round, which is a development-oriented round. And there is a concern that development is not being sufficiently mainstreamed in the GSI. I'll give you an example. I was discussing with some developing country representatives the topic of access to the source code. And there are provisions in the GSI negotiations that want to limit the cases in which governments can request a disclosure of access to the source code of computer programs as a way to preserve business trust. However, in the case of developing countries, this has an interlinkage with the transfer of technology, which is a key issue for the development of many countries. So how do we carve out in the provisions on access to the source code the necessary exceptions to ensure that access to the source code does not badly impact technology transfer and access to technology? So these are questions that I think should be on the table. Development issues shouldn't be put in a box in the GSI discussions as something that will be tackled under a very small paragraph on capacity building, but there needs to be sort of a transversal look on how the different issues would impact on development. And perhaps I think that my guess is that this would ease the mind of some developing countries that perhaps are not seeing the very clearly what is the issue for them, what they would gain in terms of helping their own development. And we cannot forget that in terms of data, there's a lot of questions on how data will be capitalized from an economic standpoint by different countries. And this is not only a question in the minds of developing countries. We need to see that developed countries such as the countries that are part of the European Union, that they have changed perspective on data sovereignty very recently. Data sovereignty was an expression that was not part of the policy lingo in the European Union until very recently. But they're talking about data sovereignty. They're talking about how to monetize industrial data. This was a big part of the State of the Union speech, for instance. So countries are looking for ways to make sure that they profit from the economic value of data. And developing countries are looking for what they call the digital industrialization, and data is a key point for that. So while these questions are not very clear, there are some points in the negotiation that will be of concern to developing countries. That's the reason why I think it's important not to bundle everything. And I do agree that it was a good approach from the GSI members to sort of separate the issues and create small groups to discuss some of these issues and move forward incrementally. So we have a text on spend that has been finalized. Recently, the text on digital signatures and authentication has been finalized. And let's see how much progress we can make, because if we bundle everything together, like I mentioned before, I think it will be really hard to have a buy-in from countries that are still struggling with issues such as development.
Thank you, Marilia. Now you have confused me a bit. You unbundled, then bundled, then unbundled again. But this is a question of negotiating tactics, and I'm sure quite a few diplomats who are following it will be inspired by this geometry of negotiations. But thank you for this sort of summary of the views. We have 5 minutes. We had an excellent comments from Yvette, from Anton Barbary on the UNCTAD negotiation, from Johannes reminding us that current negotiation on taxation in OECD has more than 125 jurisdictions, including India and China. It's not only OECD core countries, therefore it's more inclusive. But let me ask now Michael, David, and Michael, Richard, and David, for some sort of concluding remarks. A, how to bring to make it more inclusive negotiation and bring developing countries, and B, what do you expect from a ministerial meeting in December, WTO ministerial meeting? Let's start with David. David, over to you, and then we'll follow with the others. Sort of concluding remark.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Well, look, on the developing country question, I would point out that there are actually a lot of developing countries that are in the JSI, and they've been very active, and they have made proposals. I mean, it's a fair point that some developing countries aren't in the initiative, and I think Marilia makes a good point that some of them aren't confident that they have this starting point, I suppose, in terms of the regulation. But some of them within the JSI are looking to use the JSI and to drive that kind of acceleration in their domestic regulation, and are shaping the rules within the JSI. So it works for that purpose. And if you look at the spam rule, for example, that has been crafted by developing countries as well, and there are specific flexibilities in there to enable them to have a little bit of extra time to develop the regulation, and with the support of other countries too that are providing capacity building. And we certainly have gone to significant effort to ensure that developing country views are reflected in the negotiation, and the developing countries feature actively in the small groups that we've set up. We know that there are some capacity constraints for some developing countries, so we've made a real effort to make the small groups transparent, to have reporting mechanisms, to plenary, to circulate reports, to circulate the text, to make sure they're all involved. And the example you talk about with source code is an example of how that is an ongoing discussion, and there is a very active developing country in the group that has proposed a provision on this, and we're working through it. So that's an example of the sort of balance that we're trying to strike. Then I guess the other point that I would make, sorry, I'm trying to think of something profound to say as a concluding remark, and I'm not really, but the other point I want to make is that, you know, in addition to the integration of developing country views, you know, throughout the negotiation, there is a separate proposal on capacity building, and that is certainly hasn't been sidelined. That is an important part of the discussion too. And I imagine that there will be ultimately sort of capacity building mechanisms and facilities set up to ensure that developing countries can live up to some of the commitments that they're making at their shaping in the JSR. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Thank you for joining us. Apparently, I learned a lot about WTO professional culture. It's not easy to get a diplomat to speak in public events. Therefore, I really appreciate your efforts and your insights and readiness both to say what is Australia's positions, but also reflecting on other issues. Now, Richard, has our discussion moved you closer to conviction that there is something in GSI that we may explore, or you're still on your position from 1 hour before?
So I was intrigued by David's statement that developing countries are contributing because, you know, everything in WTO is secret. In fact, it's so secret that I can't even get the documents if I ask the Swiss mission to show them to me privately. So I don't actually know what's going on. Now, from what's been leaked, that's not what I've seen at all. Well, from what's been leaked, I've seen that basically the gist of the significant proposals, which as we know is about data and about source code and so forth, that's just copy pasted from the USMCA. That is the agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the US, which, as we know, was simply dictated by Trump and his negotiators. And it wasn't just Trump, it's reflecting longstanding US policy. So what I see is simply stuff that's coming from the US. So the Marielia's question, you know, why are they not participating? Well, you know, if I were a developing country, I'd say, well, you know, these aren't really trade issues. So why should my guy at WTO be wasting his time on that when he's got more important things to do, notably fisheries, agriculture, and so on? And plus e-commerce is not a big issue. It works fine. You know, my people are able to do what they want to do, except they don't have good internet access and they don't have payment systems. You guys aren't addressing those. I'd really like to address those issues. So you're not addressing the actual issues that I'm interested in. Oh, and by the way, when I look at your proposals, they're pretty obvious, just the US big tech agenda. So, you know, why would I be wasting my time on this stuff? And in terms of what MC12 could do, well, you know, I think that's pretty obvious. The only two good things that the ministerial could do would be agree the patent waiver for TRIPS so that we could actually produce enough COVID vaccine so we wouldn't have literally tens of thousands of Indians dying now because we don't produce enough vaccine. Let's get real, guys. That's the real issue right now. And second, abolish the moratorium on e-commerce, but I agree that's not going to happen. They're probably going to renew it for 2 years. Okay, let's go through another 2 years of nonsense with this. But really, let's focus on the priorities. We know that the current patent system is really stifling the production of COVID vaccine, and that really should be addressed because it's not a WIPO problem, it's a TRIPS problem, and TRIPS needs to be waived in order for that to be approved.
Thank you, Richard. For those of you who would like to see how we explore these topics, I challenged in the interview Richard on the question that it is just the copied from the US. Even in the US, you have a big debate about tech companies and their monopolies. But my challenge was that we have in GSI, we have China, we have Russia, we have Australia, European Union, countries that do not control the data. But I invite you to click on the interview with Richard and you will hear how that debate get a bit deeper and more focused on these issues. Now, Michael, you have now the difficult task to put quite a few threads together and to give us some hope sign. Marilia has a hand up, therefore we'll pass also to her. But first to Michael.
Right, I think I'll let her have the final word, having started the discussion to finish it. But I think that I would actually go to some of the points that were made at the beginning, and that I think that other parts of Geneva are going to play a big role in bringing the countries together, whether it's in regional agreements or through the WTO. I think that the digital divide needs to be closed more so that there's more people online with good access. I think that there is a payment issue, which is also not a Geneva issue. I think that building up the e-commerce and building up the trust is going to be, online trust is going to be important. And having it all come through, you know, data privacy, data flows, all of that through WTO seems not just an issue of competence, but these are much broader issues than trade. You know, data sovereignty strikes at a lot of points in countries. And then I think that there's going to be digital single markets showing up, whether it's in East Africa, in ASEAN, or other regions where they'll be able to trade more on a level playing field. And that will bring the companies some scale and confidence and ability to then go onto the global market through global trade rules.
Thank you, Michael. I can see behind you Red Book, Factfulness by Hans Rosling. And we need more facts, and inspired by Hans Rosling, we need more evidence what's going on around us in the digital economy. Therefore, I advise everybody to follow Michael and to have the Hans Rosling book on the facts and factfulness. Marilia, quickly over to you, and we will close. Otherwise, we'll become persona non grata, breaching the Swiss precision on the time, because we are 4 minutes over the time.
Thank you, Jovan. Just a very brief word on capacity building, which I think we all agree is a key issue. Diplo, ITC, and UNCTAD Geneva are offering a course on digital commerce, which will tackle many of the digital issues that have been mentioned in the debate today and are being discussed in the WTO and elsewhere. Applications are open until the 12th of May, and this course will be offered to capital-based officials as well, from developing countries and LDC. So not only open to Geneva diplomats as we normally do, but we extend it to capital-based as well. Thank you, Jovan, and thanks everyone for this great debate.
Thank you. Well, that's difficult to summarize, and I won't try. I will summarize through the book on the Michael's shelf. We need more facts, more evidence, more understanding, more clear debate and engaging debate like this one that we had today. We need more permanent missions. In that context, special thanks go to David for joining us with the clarity of thinking and position. As always, Richard was challenging the dominant views, but he inched towards sort of from the binary towards analog consideration of some issues. Marilia brought capacity development, great comments from our audience. All in all, I'm re-energized, and I can go now for my lunch with the feeling that we achieved something. And I would like to thank you all, participants, for their time, our excellent panelists, and we move on with this important mission for Geneva and all actors in Geneva to make more inclusive, more impactful, and more informed digital governance discussions, including those on e-commerce. Have a nice day. Bye.